Oh, hey. How's your evening going so far? Busy.
But good. Can't complain. Busy's
No?
good.
I mean, I just got off work, so I'm just being lazy. So it's completely the opposite.
uh, I, I'm still in the office, so
Um,
I'm not going to be
what
done
do
for
you do?
some time.
Oh, okay.
Calls
All right. And you?
in out in New York. No, it's a
Oh, and
company.
they're okay with you just doing a debate on the side?
Uh, this is yeah. They have no problem. Nobody cares. I'm not really. Everybody's practically gone. I mean, it's 9 o'clock, but yeah, nobody
Nice.
cares.
Yeah, I mean, I do research, so like when I'm in the office and everything, like I can be on Facebook or whatever, because and it's like I'm researching. I'm on Facebook because I'm researching. But if I do a debate,
All
they'd be
right.
like, "What are you doing?" Yeah.
Also, you're Pacific. What time zone are you in?
Yeah, I'm with the Pacific Legal Foundation, so it's like a conservative slash libertarian public interest law.
No, no, I meant no, I meant what
Oh,
time zone are
Pacific,
you
yeah,
in?
Pacific time zone. So yeah, it's
Pacific.
6 o'clock here. Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right.
So I know that we had meant to do this a while back. Uh,
Yes, I apologize. It got crazy here for a while, but now it's slowed down
oh
a bit.
yeah,
So we're
yeah.
having it now.
No, I mean it was partially my problem too because I mean I think I like been sick, but
Yes, one time, yeah.
anyway, so with this topic, there are a couple of things that I would want to say on it. The main thing I have a problem with here is inalienable. So I'm pro gun rights. I don't know if you saw, but for my semifinal debate in the tournament that they just had, I defended, like I said, we should not accept Australia's gun. Yeah,
Australia's,
so
yeah.
I'm for guns, but I don't believe that they are an inalienable right at all. So first of all, what do I mean by inalienable? Inalienable is something that cannot be taken away. It's something that is inherent within you. It's deserved by your status as a human being. At least that's the common argument that is made for an inalienable right. And my video just died. Dang it. Whatever. We don't need my video.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
these okay.
So the
Yeah.
there are a couple things I would say to that. The first thing would be, I don't believe there is such a thing as an inalienable right. So I would ask you, do you think that if someone does something wrong, is prison a reasonable thing for them to receive? Is that reasonable?
Obviously, it would depend upon what they did wrong. If somebody jaywalks, would prison be reasonable? Absolutely not. If somebody is robbing other people and disrupting other people's lives, is prison reasonable?
Okay.
100%.
And if you are being attacked, would you then have the right to respond in self-defense? Perhaps in war, would you have a right to defend yourself through violence, which could lead to death? Or if you're being home invaded, would you have a right to respond potentially with deadly force?
Yes. Deadly force would obviously depend on the
Right.
circumstance,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, the thing is, I absolutely agree with that. And I think both of those are reasons to say that there is no such thing as an inalienable right. Because for something to be inalienable means that it cannot be taken away. However, what both of us already agree is that if I invade your home, you would have a right to defend yourself. And if I potentially am about to kill you, you would have the right in self defense to kill me. I did not have an inalienable right to life because that right was dependent on certain conditions. Like, for instance, that I do not violate certain accepted norms. This means that there isn't an inalienable right to life because it's dependent on certain conditions. There also isn't an inalienable right to liberty because, as we both agree, if someone does something that is contrary to dangerously contrary to social norms, they can be imprisoned. This takes away their liberty. This means that there is not an inalienable right to life or liberty or property because it is dependent on us meeting certain accepted conditions. So the first argument that I would make on this point is that there is no such thing as an inalienable right because it always will be dependent on other things.
All right. So in response to that, two things. Two things. When I say inalienable, I don't know if you hear, but there's a bad echo. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
you
hear
hear me?
you. Sorry if it's
I got much better. Yeah, I don't know what happened. When I say inalienable, what I mean by that is it is a right that has not been bestowed or has not been granted to you by government or anybody else. For instance, would you agree? Let's say there's a country that's set up that says murder is okay. Murder is legally acceptable in this country. Would you have a problem
Yes, I
with
would.
that? Why?
Because I believe that that is a problem for society. That would be a dangerous society to live within. I wouldn't say it's because there's this natural inherent thing that everyone should have. It would be more because on the basis of what would make the best society, we recognize, hey, all of us, every single one of us would prefer to be alive. So we should recognize that. And for the purpose of making the best society, we recognize murder is wrong.
So murder's wrong only because it's not beneficial to society, or murder's wrong because it's wrong to kill, to take away somebody's life?
Because I would say that every single thing comes down to what is beneficial to society. That's the reason we would make the law in the first place.
So let's say society would benefit from it. Say I'm going to kill somebody and he's an extremely wealthy person. I'll spread his money around and feed the poor. And the only way for me to get that money is to kill this person.
Well, first of all, this is a little off track because this isn't really the focus that I'm going with here. But in answer to that, what I'm subscribing to is rural utilitarianism, not just in every individual instance utilitarianism, but rural utilitarianism, which would be that there are certain standards which we recognize as a rule have a benefit to society, like murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, rape is wrong, these sorts of things. Even though we might have individual examples of where maybe murder is good, maybe rape is good, I can't imagine why it would be, but even if there are individual examples, rural utilitarianism would hold that for the benefit of society, we still hold it as a rule, and so we make that as a law.
I'm asking a hypothetical. Say killing an X amount of people were to benefit society. Let's say a virus came out that really hinders people's way of life, and there's only one way to solve it, and that's by killing a select few. Would you agree in theory that would then be the problem at that point in killing a couple people?
No, that would be against the concept that I was laying out of rural utilitarianism. If you're going with purely a utilitarian philosophy, just pure straight utilitarianism, then you would maybe say that's good. But I'm not.
I want to know what you believe in that hypothetical question. What would you do? What would you say in that scenario? The correct thing, the right thing to do.
From a public policy perspective, we would still have the law against murder.
Not public policy. A philosophical question. What do you think? You personally, in such a instance, there are 5 people living that have a certain blood type. The only way to get their blood is to kill them. If we get their blood, society as a whole benefits. It will make people give the entire world a euphoric feeling. Everybody.
From a moral perspective, I would defend a right to life, which would be based on your and I've described this to Chandler and Stephen before, but it's based on your consciousness. The fact that you are cognizant of your own capability gives you a deserved amount of difference from another animal. The fact that you are recognizing of who you are as a person gives you an advantage over, say, a blade of grass. And it would be wrong to essentially steal your life from you. It would also be wrong to cause you pain. If you are able to feel pain, and if you are cognizant of your own existence, it would be wrong to take your life from you.
What's wrong with taking my life from me? Is it wrong from you from stealing wheat from unknown land?
In the same way that we would say that stealing, we recognize that as an individual, it would be worse if you stole from me. I would not enjoy it if you stole from me. I would also not enjoy it. I would not prefer it if you were to kill me. And I can expound from that in the same way that the people around me say the same thing. So if I steal from them, they would disapprove of that. If I kill them, they will disapprove of that. And because of this, we establish that, okay, there is a core basis for saying that people should be allowed to be alive.
Correct. I would stealing from people, which is violating another inalienable right, property of ownership, I would agree that they would fall into the same basket. But my question is, when you get to the fundamental, when you get to the bottom of it, what did I do that's wrong? What society's benefiting? Let me take this person's life and benefit everybody else. It's like me. He doesn't have a right to his own life. He doesn't have a right to life. What am I doing wrong? And obviously, it's a hypothetical because it's a philosophical question. It's not. It's a question that we're not encountering right now. But to get to the bottom of it, to get to understanding why you can't kill the next person, you really gotta boil it down to that. Why can I not kill someone if everybody as a whole will benefit?
Well, the argument that I have been giving is that it would stem from inside of you, that it starts from within us, and that expands out to society. We base our preferences are what contribute to what society then wants. It starts from the individual, branches out to society. What argument would you be giving?
I would. My argument is that everybody has an inalienable right to life. That we have a natural right to life that you are not allowed to violate, no matter what. There are times when you can, and which is to touch on the point you mentioned in the beginning, which was your proof, so to speak, that it can't be inalienable. For instance, because if somebody's coming to attack you, that you can go ahead and kill them. So that proves that it's not inalienable. That doesn't mean that it's not inalienable. The reason why if somebody attacks me, I can kill them is because, and that's what Thomas Aquinas, he explains it thoroughly, that when somebody's the aggressor or the attacker, he is more or less forfeiting that right by putting you into the position where you have to then take away in order to preserve your life now does become more valuable than the person that is coming to kill you. So when you have to make that decision, obviously you're gonna have to take the life. But that doesn't throw out the entire understanding of the fact that I have a right to life. Therefore, you cannot just take my life. If I have absolutely zero right to be alive, I have no right to self-preservation, then I understand that right now, practically today, we're not going to kill someone because that's not really an effective way of setting up a society, because then it's just going to be everybody running around killing the next person. But that's why I'm giving you a hypothetical case, because it's a philosophical question of if it benefits everybody, what exactly? I know it comes from inside, it comes from consciousness, but what is it? What they don't have a right to their own life. Why can I not? It's everybody as a whole in that hypothetical scenario. You're saying something from within that spreads out, but what is it exactly what is that thing exactly that stops me from being able to kill that person?
Let me first point out, I've never said there's no such thing as rights. I think there are rights. My question is on inalienable rights. An inalienable right, as defined, if you look it up, inalienable is defined as unable to be taken away or given away by the possessor. And yet nobody believes in that. Everybody agrees that prisons are valid and that you have a right to defend yourself if you are being attacked, and that if your country is being attacked, you have a right to defend yourself with deadly force. Thus, we all already know there is no such thing as an inalienable right to life. There may be a right to life, but it is conditional and dependent upon the fact that we do not violate other people's accepted rights. So that's ultimately the answer that I would give there. But let's move on to another part, because I think that we've probably said enough about this at this point. The idea, again, of inalienable, something that would be inalienable would be something that would be dependent on your status as a human. It comes from within you as a human. An inalienable right, I suppose you could say that an elephant could have it, but we don't say that elephants have inalienable rights to healthcare. They don't have inalienable rights to guns. They don't have inalienable rights to any of these things. But we eat chickens, so obviously we don't think chickens have an inalienable right to life. So it is something that we are saying is dependent on being human. As such, this would mean that it is something that exists outside of time. It is something that we simply own by virtue of being human. So in 50 years, if a human is born, this human would still have this inalienable, as it's so called, right. And 50 years ago, a human would also have that same inalienable right because they are humans. So it's not dependent on time. So I think that this necessarily disproves the idea of guns being inalienable rights because guns did not exist for the vast majority of time. So a caveman, I'd like to use the caveman example to determine, first of all, I don't really think inalienable rights exist in the first place, but even if we were to say inalienable rights exist, you can use the caveman example. Because cavemen, you can say, would a caveman have had a right to a $20 copay on his health insurance? No, because health insurance didn't exist. Would a caveman, we would say that it would certainly be much preferable that those cavemen had recognized that it is better that all of them have a right to life and a right to be free and a right to own their personal stick. We could say all of these things. But we would not be able to say they have a right to a $20 copay on their health insurance, nor could we say they have an inalienable right to guns, because guns didn't exist. For this reason, it seems clear to me that guns are not an inalienable right. They are something which currently we recognize is better to give to people as a practical right, but that's very different than the idea of an inalienable right.
I agree with that 1,000,000%. The inalienable right, which is the right to self-preservation, the right of self-defense, that's the entire right. My entire right is to preserve my life, to defend myself if necessary, which may even result in me taking somebody else's life. The right isn't the guns and guns itself. But however, if at this point in time, the way to defend myself, the only way to defend myself effectively, is guns, then you taking away my guns is you essentially taking away my right to self-defense. So although you're correct, the actual inalienable right is not to guns, which is very simple. Obviously, guns haven't always existed, and guns may cease to exist in another 1,000. They may cease to exist. The actual right is right to self-preservation, the right to defend myself. At this point in time, at the time we're having this conversation, the only way for me to effectively do that is through having a gun. You taking away my gun is you taking away my ability to defend myself, is you taking away my right of self-preservation. So correct, the actual right is not on the piece of metal, it's not on the gun, but it's the right is me giving me the ability to defend myself with whatever means it takes, any way that I need to at that point in time. And right now, at this point in time, that's gone.
So I would agree with you that I think we can offer people a right to self-preservation, which is essentially another variant of the right to life. So yeah, I would agree with that. But at the same time, that first of all disproves the idea of an inalienable right to guns, because it's not inalienable. That would mean that it is, again, conditional. It's dependent on what other weapons are available at the time. The next argument that I would go to here would be that your argument is dependent on locality. For instance, in a place where there are no guns, there would be no need for a gun. Even right now, if there is no gun in a country, then your argument disproves the idea that you would need a gun. Your argument is dependent on there being a country filled with guns. So perhaps the United Kingdom, which doesn't have guns and has a lower rate of homicide than the United States. So that would be an example of a country in which you would not have, according to you, an inalienable right to guns. So even at this current point in time, your argument is not, it doesn't show an inalienable right to guns, whether by time or by location, because it only works in certain specific areas, like, for instance, the United States. And I would agree with you that at least right now in the United States, for the purposes of self-preservation, people do need guns. But that's A, not an inalienable right to a gun, and B, dependent on location.
So first, I disagree with the premise that it goes by location. I believe everybody in any country should have an inalienable right to a gun. But again, when I say inalienable, what I mean is it is a right that is not bestowed. It is not given to you. It's not a legal right. I don't have this right because because my government tells me I can have this right. I have this right because I can have a gun because I needed to preserve my life. Now, if we're disagreeing on that premise, we could disagree on that premise. But if you take that premise at face value, if you agree that I do have a right now to self-preservation, and if at that point in time a gun is what will give it to me, then the fact that some countries don't give you that right doesn't negate the fact that it is still a natural right. Some countries are violating that right, but that doesn't mean that the right doesn't exist.
Well, actually, that still doesn't respond to this whole idea of location, because in countries where they do not have guns, or they have a much lower rate of guns, their rate of homicide is oftentimes much lower. You can actually look at the rate of homicides all around the world. Out of 219 countries, the United States is 126th, which I'm not saying that guns equals more homicide. But what I am saying here is we would not need guns if there weren't other people with guns in the country. Somewhere like the United Kingdom does not need guns. They have a lower rate of homicide than us. Many of the European countries which have banned guns have lower rates of homicide than the United States. Why? Well, for one thing, they have different ways of defending themselves. So your right to self-preservation does not, even at this current time, require guns. It only requires guns depending on the location you are in.
So on that, a few things. One, the number of homicides per country, whether there's any correlation to guns or not, if you want, we could get to that later. I think that's an entire different discussion, which I totally disagree with. But as far as saying that it's not an inalienable right by the fact that countries that don't have guns, you don't need a gun to protect yourself. Again, I'm going to go back to my right is to protect myself with whatever means necessary. Now, in countries where there are no guns, right, it has to be at least an equal level playing field. So if people are attacking me with guns, now in America, there are people that have guns. There are people that break the law. There are criminals that have guns. So that in America right now, in order for me to protect myself, what is necessary is a gun. That's what's necessary. If you take that gun away from me, what you just did is you took away my means. You took away my means to protect my life for self-defense, for self-preservation. Taking away my gun violates my right of self-preservation. Now, in a place where there are no guns, so if everybody has swords, so me protecting myself, I can protect myself with a sword because they're just coming at me with a sword. Then if you want to make the case that over there not letting me have a gun it doesn't violate anything, I can agree to that. But because you are not violating my right to self-defense. That's one. Two, there's another right of having a gun, and that's more than self-defense. The right to owning a gun is also for liberty, and that's to keep government in check, because as history has shown, governments can become tyrannical and have become tyrannical, and the only way to keep that in check, to ensure that doesn't happen, is having an armed population. So even in countries where the population may not have guns, I would still hold there's an inalienable right to possess guns, and that would be to ensure that your right of liberty does not get infringed.
All right, so a couple things to clarify then. The first thing is that we both agree that there isn't a necessarily inalienable right to guns. You're arguing for an inalienable right to self-preservation and then for liberty, but not necessarily for guns. Guns are just the means of self-preservation. Then we also agree that in certain...
I hate to interrupt, but if that's the case you're making, then why don't you make it simpler? There's no inalienable right to guns because in some languages it's not pronounced guns. There's another name for it. Why not make that easier case?
Because that's not the same at all. An inalienable right would be something that is necessarily dependent on being human. And sure, in a different language, we'd call it something else, but it would still exist. There's still the argument you could make for it. But I think that the argument itself would be flawed because it would not be inalienable in any language. Because in any language, no matter how you were or no matter where you were arguing for it, it's something that is dependent on time. It is also dependent on what everyone else around you has. Like you pointed out, there wouldn't be an inalienable right to a gun in a place where everyone has swords and nobody has guns. They wouldn't be needed. And the next thing to say here would be that what you're arguing for essentially is creating the very problem you're trying to solve. In the same way that mutually assured destruction, we gather a bunch of different weapons because, oh no, he might have more weapons. Oh, well, I need to get a weapon. Oh no, he might get a bigger weapon. I need to get a bigger weapon. And so we eventually have this race to more and more weapons. Eventually, you get to the worst types of weapons possible. Then your argument means everyone should have every single weapon. This is when we also get into the next point that you made, which is that we need to be able to defend ourselves from a tyrannical government. I think this is silly. Originally, it made sense. I think it definitely made sense back when weapons were much, much smaller. But as the world increasingly gets more and more technological, weapons become more and more advanced. It is foolish to assume that citizens should simply have access to all weapons. Because think about some of the weapons that currently exist. There are biological, as in like diseases, biological weapons. Should every citizen have access to biological weapons simply because his neighbor might have a biological weapon or the government might have a biological weapon? It doesn't make sense. It's dangerous, and it leads to possibly the loss of far more lives. Should all citizens have intercontinental ballistic missiles because their government has intercontinental ballistic missiles? It's dangerous, and it will likely lead to far more deaths because an unsecured ICBM by somebody down the street from me could very well destroy my entire street. It's far more dangerous and simply not rational. But if we follow your argument to its extreme, that's what it means. Because this self-preservation is based on, okay, I need to have the same weapon that the person around me has. But that's just not true. Because there's a certain point, especially as guns or any weapon continues to get more and more technologically advanced, it becomes dangerous for the citizens to have. And the last thing I'm going to say here is that the reason that this also applies to your argument about governments is that in the past, when muskets or whatever were the guns that were around, the government had relatively the same weapons as the civilians. Today, if a government wanted to wipe out its citizens, there's absolutely nothing that the citizens can do about that. Absolutely nothing. So it's irrelevant to try and argue that citizens need to be able to defend against the government today, because it just wouldn't work. If the U.S. government legitimately wanted to take out all of the U.S. citizens in a day, they already could. And there's nothing we can do about that. There's no amount of gun rights that would be able to defend against that. So we either allow all citizens to have chemical, biological weapons, nukes, etc., which is going to have a very likely short-term detriment to society, or we recognize that there are certain things that the citizens must be prevented from having. I'd say that includes weapons of war.
All right. So on what you mentioned, a number of things. One, 100%, the citizens should not have any single weapon that they care to have, because obviously that will lead to utter complete destruction. So I don't need to have a nuke because my neighbor doesn't have a nuke, so I'm not protecting myself against a nuke. I don't need a tank because my neighbor doesn't have a tank, so I'm not protecting myself from a tank, nor a rocket launcher, any of that. I just need to have a gun because all my neighbors coming at me is with a gun. So as far as protecting myself from my neighbor, all I need, a gun is sufficient. Now, on your point against the government, two points on that you mentioned, that obviously if the government waged all-out war against its citizens, that they'd ultimately obviously win the war. On that, two things. One, we do find, and we have found, and we find even still today, that guerrilla warfare is extremely effective, even against adversaries that are extremely high-tech and advanced. we have the United States government as extremely technologically advanced, and we still have a hard time fighting against Taliban, fighting from extremely old weapons, fighting out of caves with really not much. Guerrilla war, we see it from the partisans in the Second World War. There are books written about it. They were a real thorn in the side of the Nazis. And they were a band of people with no food, no clothes, and guns that sometimes worked. We do find that guerrilla warfare is extremely and highly effective against even far superior armies. That's just that's the way history has shown us, and we still see today where we have advanced armies fighting against small little groups of insurgents. On the second point is correct. If the United States government waged all-out war against all of its citizens, whether it might will probably take some time, but they will probably eventually win. But why are you creating that the only scenario? That's not how tyranny typically starts. I mean, again, let's go back to history. Tyranny isn't where government gets up and points all their ballistic missiles at all of their citizens and say war and start firing. Tyranny could start with them taking land, taking things that don't belong to them, enacting laws that are unjust. Tyranny starts really small, and we have found in the past where the federal government have gotten into a confrontation with some militia groups. Sometimes the government has been in the right, sometimes the militia groups have been in the right, but we've seen that these groups of militia have pushed the United States federal government back, and they backed off. So it's I've heard this argument many times. Why is that the only scenario? If America wages all-out war, they'll win. So let's not put anything in place to keep them in check, because why keep them in check? They'll just wage war. That's not necessarily going to happen. That's really extremely highly unlikely to happen. What's more likely to happen is that they impose laws and we have instances of them being tyrannical, which can grow and grow and grow, and to keep them in check, having an armed population. And that's why you find it. The number one thing, the first thing any fascist or any dictator, the first thing they do is they disarm the population. Why not just wage all-out war? Because it makes it much easier for them to put in place their oppressive agenda, and which infringes upon the freedoms of their citizens by taking away the arms of those said citizens.
So you said a couple things there. The first thing that I think I agree with is you said if currently your neighbor doesn't have a nuke, so you don't need a nuke. And if your neighbor didn't have a gun, you wouldn't need a gun. But that's also my point, which is that the reason you need guns, and there are certain places where I would agree that there is a practical need for a gun, but it's not an inalienable need for a gun. First of all, because it's dependent on time. So we would agree that this is a very current thing. It's not something that has existed before. Thus, it's not an inalienable need. And secondly, because it's dependent on location, that it's only taking place in places where you need this gun in the first place. And it's not taking place in places where we wouldn't need this gun. So it's not an inalienable right at all. You then talked about how governments, if governments, because I had argued that if government wanted to take out its people, it could. And you said that would not take place because, first of all, you talked about the Taliban and how we're having difficulty fighting the Taliban. A couple of answers to that. The first one would be the reason we have difficulty taking out Taliban is because of human rights. Ironically, the reason why the government has difficulty taking out Taliban or people who are fighting guerrilla warfare is because our government is actually kind of good. This isn't a tyrannical government. And if they wanted to take out the Taliban, if they were tyrannical and really wanted to take out the Taliban, they would drop a nuke on the Taliban. Boom, end of war. That's it. But obviously, the government is not tyrannical, which is where we get to the second problem, which is you said that it's unlikely that government would try and take out its citizens. It's also unlikely that they would be tyrannical in the first place. But if they were to become tyrannical, obviously they don't care about any of these rights anymore. So it's just as likely, by which I mean it's ridiculously unlikely that government will be tyrannical, but it's also ridiculously unlikely in the same way that they would want to take out the citizens. They're the same thing. If government was to become tyrannical, there's just as much of a likelihood that they would want to take out their citizens. So this isn't a reason to consider that side in the first place. So anyway, let me just kind of summarize where I see this whole thing with inalienable. So an inalienable, let me just read this one more time. Inalienable is something that is unable to be taken away from or given away by the possessor. I don't think anyone believes in that. I don't think there is such a thing as an inalienable right, because all of us would already agree that all of our rights are conditional on us not doing problematic things. As soon as we do problematic things, there is no longer this inalienable right. There's a right, and I think we would agree that there is a right, but it's not an inalienable right. Next, we then talk about this whole concept of whether or not something matters if it's new. And I'd say because it is something that is current to this time period in history, that means it's not inalienable, because a caveman didn't have it, because our friends in the 1400s or whatever would not have had this same right. Then you get into the problem that it's also dependent on location and what is around you. Like, for instance, if we have Japan, in Japan you don't need a gun because nobody else around you has a gun. So there's no inalienable right there. And then the last thing there would be that it is also dependent on what weapons are around you. So if you're and that this causes the problem in the first place, that because America has this right to guns, that's also what creates the need for a right to guns. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we didn't have a right to guns, we wouldn't have a need for guns because nobody would have guns. So ultimately, I'm not saying guns are bad. I don't think they are bad. But what I am saying is that they're not an inalienable right, really in any way that we look at it, because there's nothing about it that is automatically inherently deserved. Even the only thing that is automatically inherently deserved, which I don't know if there is necessarily anything, but even if there was, it would just be a right to self-preservation, not to guns.
All right, so a number of things to tackle over there. One is just getting back to a tyrannical government. Again, obviously, if they wanted to nuke the entire population, nothing's going to stop them, and I agree with that. But to go ahead and put that as the only scenario of a tyrannical government is, I'm not sure why you're making that the only scenario. Are you saying that if you can't stop every type of tyrannical government in every scenario, then don't stop any scenario? Or are you saying that's the only scenario? I'm not sure exactly what you're saying by that. And again, you're saying that there's no reason to suspect the possibility of a government becoming tyrannical. History has shown that not to be true. I mean, we've had tyrannical governments for as long as history, documented history. I'm not what happened at what point in time that you're going to say that from this point on it is unreasonable to suspect that it's possible for a government to become tyrannical. And again, getting back to inalienable. Inalienable means that this right does not come from someone else. This right comes to me from, you could call it from nature, it could come from reason, it could come from God, whatever you want to call it. But this right does not come from someone else. Now, again, I have a right to life. I would say I have a right to breathe. But you're going to say, but you don't, maybe in 100 years we can invent a way of living without breathing, so it's not inalienable. If that's your case, then I'll concede. But I believe inalienable right is anything necessary at that point in time to keep that right, to keep that right. Right now, and there's the point that I mentioned before, my right to defend myself is only so good as my ability to defend myself. If I say, you know what, you have a right to defend yourself, but no ability to defend yourself, that right is really meaningless. So my right to defend myself is really only so much a right as my ability. And whatever it is at that time, whatever it takes at that time is my right. Because if you take that away, you are taking away my right. So again, if you took away my gun right now, my ability to defend myself goes out the window, and I now can't defend myself. So if we're agreeing that there is such a thing as a inalienable right. Obviously, we have to agree to this premise to get there. I know you disagree with it, but say we agree with that to get to the next step, that there is an inalienable right to life, and which would be to self-preservation. If you take away my gun, that right goes out the window, because a right means nothing if there's nothing you can do about that right, if there's no way to enforce that right, no way to keep that right alive. So taking away my gun in a point, obviously, in a time when guns exist, taking it away is throwing my right out the window. So my right is what tells you can't take away my gun.
So obviously, I don't think we are necessarily agreeing on whether or not there is such a thing as this inalienable right, but we do agree that there's a right, and both of us would agree that at least in certain areas, guns are we would term them a right. What we're questioning is whether or not they would be inalienable. And you're saying that an inalienable will be something that comes to you from nature, and which is anything necessary at that point in time to keep that right. But the problem with this is that if it comes to you from nature, if it's inherent within you, it's not something that changes with time. It's not something that would be dependent on where we are at the current moment in history. It's something that all humans, whether now, in the past, or in the future, would all deserve. That's what it would mean to be inalienable. What you're arguing is that there's this practical right, that there's a current need, but that's not an inalienable right. That's very different. And then we come back to the whole idea, is there even an inalienable right in the first place, which I don't think there is. And I see no reason, I don't think anyone believes that there is such a thing as an inalienable right, because all of us would agree that it is based on certain conditions. Thus, it can be taken away if you were to violate those conditions. There's no such thing as this inalienable right in the first place. But even if there was, even if we were to say that, guns wouldn't meet that definition because they're dependent on time and location. You then talk about how the right to defend yourself is dependent on the ability to defend yourself. But my answer to that would be that it's caused by the existence of guns in the first place. You need to defend yourself. You need to be able to do it with guns, but that's only because guns are in that area. If guns weren't in that area, there wouldn't be a need for guns in the first place. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This need for guns creates the same need for guns. And that's why in places that have banned guns, it's difficult at first, but ultimately they do wind up seeing certain amounts of homicide go down. Like I had asked my friend this the other day, and I think that he and I both kind of agreed, if guns were to disappear magically from America tomorrow, America would probably be benefited. Like it would probably be better. Not that that's possible, and I don't think it's possible. And currently in America, you do kind of need a gun because the person who's going to come at you is probably going to have a gun. But that's not an inalienable reason to need a gun. That's a current practical reason to have a gun. And I will let you have the last word here, so you can go ahead and finish up there.
So on that, again, and that's a conversation which we could have. If we can magically make all guns disappear, would we be better off? But that's an entire conversation itself. But again, and Thomas Aquinas addresses this: the fact that I can kill someone who's coming to kill me, that doesn't undermine the underlying principle that I do have a right to live. When I go and try to take somebody else's right to live, then by him having a right to kill me, by keeping his right to live alive, that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to live. And again, that's why when I started off at the beginning, if there is no right to life, if nobody has a right to live, besides the fact that you said that it's beneficial to society, say I have scenarios that society benefits and I relegate it, and it's only in those specific circumstances. It's not going to go out and people are not going to continuously do it. People aren't just going to go around killing each other. Just in that specific instance, why can I not kill someone, take their blood? If I crush these people up and fertilize it, the ground, beautiful flowers will come. Everybody will benefit. Everybody would enjoy it. Nobody would feel bad. Why can I not take these people's life? And you have to come to this understanding that there's an inalienable right. And inalienable means that this right was not given to me by somebody. Therefore, it cannot be taken away. Now, I can lose that right because when I take away, infringe on somebody else's rights, but that right exists. And again, if that right doesn't exist, then why can't we just kill people when it benefits society as a whole? That's why I think you have to come to the inalienable to